Hello and welcome to chapter 2 of our new book in the Head Teacher Reads series, and we are delving already deep into the world of tin. Chapter 1 yesterday, we met some of the key characters. We met Jack and Christopher. We met Absalom, Mr. Absalom, who was trying his very best to sell one of his mechanicals, and it didn't quite go as he hoped at the very end. All it took was one word for the sale to come crashing down, and Jack quite literally as well. So here we are, chapter 2. Let's see what happens. Back in the truck, Jack took off his brown wig, reached under his seat, took his usual ginger hair out and fixed it back on his head. Once he was happy it was in place, he wriggled a little, shoved his hands under one of his legs and frowned. "I think I've dented my bum." This made Christopher snort with laughter. Jack joined in. The two of them giggled while Absalom wrestled with the steering wheel as he violently pulled the truck onto the road. The two boys were still giggling. Absalom couldn't take it anymore. "And you," he snarled, turning to Christopher, who stopped giggling abruptly. "Me? What did I do?" "Nothing. That's what you did. Nothing." "What was I supposed to do?" "What I trained you to do. Assist me in making a sale, that's what. Do some patter, add in observations, make grand claims for the merchandise." "His name is Jack," said Christopher. He looked at Absalom. Their eyes locked. They would have continued that way if Jack hadn't interrupted and pointed out something rather more pertinent. "Mr. Absalom, the road." Absalom whipped his head round just in time to turn the wheel and stop them careering into a ditch. He swore and they continued their journey through the dark. The agonised swish and groan of the wipers counterpointed by Absalom's muttering. The mounds of scrap in the junkyard were disappearing under layers of snow when they arrived back, and round Rob was waiting for them just outside Absalom's shed cum office. He still looked as frightened as when they'd left a couple of hours ago, but when he spied Jack in the passenger seat, the look on his face turned to one of relief. Manda was also with Rob, holding his hand. Her teddy bear was hanging from her other hand. "He didn't sell you," Round Rob said to Jack as he waddled towards them as fast as he could. It was more of a statement of relief than an observation. Jack shook his head. Rob smiled and rested a hand on his ample chest. Rob was shorter than Christopher, and he was round and squat. The trunk of his body was made from an old cooking pot. The one advantage Absalom found in his construction was that Rob could be hired out for proper children to roll him down hills at festivals and fetes. Christopher spotted the strands of fraying blonde hair that spilt over Rob's right eye, and he felt a strange pang of guilt. Manda ran to Christopher and hugged his leg. Christopher chuckled. "We weren't gone that long, Mand." "We were worried," said Manda, looking up at him. Her grin was crooked as ever, and the brown curls on her head didn't sit quite right. Her left eye was also larger than the right, and her right leg was shorter than her left, a source of frustration for Christopher, who kept asking Absalom when he was going to get her a proper leg. Absalom would always fob him off with what he thought was a witty comment about it taking so long because he could never decide whether to get a shorter left leg or a longer right leg. Then he'd deliver his trademark cackle and Christopher would turn away in disgust. They all turned at the sound of Absalom slamming the truck door. He headed towards his shed, coat rippling in his wake. "What happened, Mr. Absalom?" Rob piped up. Absalom wheeled around. "Absolute and utter disaster. That's what happened, Robert, and it's all thanks to these two." "That's not true," shouted Christopher. "We didn't even know what you were up to until we got there." "And a good thing too," said Absalom, wagging a finger. "Otherwise you would have been moralising, young Christopher." moralising as usual, when the one thing you forget is that business is business, interrupted Christopher. Exactly, said Absalom, still too angry to notice the sarcastic tone in Christopher's voice. Their standoff was interrupted by a great rhythmic clanking sound, and Gripper strode into view from behind a pile of junk. Absalom liked to refer to Gripper proudly as his firstborn. He was the oldest in the yard, even older than Manda. He was also the largest, standing over 8 feet tall, with a barrel chest that tapered to his waist. He had tree-trunk-wide legs and great clod-hopping feet. His huge arms were a muscled collage of wires and rivets and piping. They ended in gigantic clawed hands that served as both shovels and miniature crushers. His lower jaw was made from what looked like the triangular cowcatcher of a steam locomotive, making his chin jut out and give him a gormless look. It was illegal to create adult-sized mechanicals who were self-aware. Absalom had built Gripper to such extreme dimensions because he reckoned it meant that he fell outside the legal definition of what's adult-sized and proper. He reasoned that creating something as exceptional as Gripper meant that he couldn't be prosecuted for breaking the law. Most mechanicals had their propulsion and consciousness glyphs carved on their skulls, but Gripper had the large curved symbols all over his body. Something as large as he was needed more magic to power him. And yet, despite his appearance and the suggestion of fierceness, Gripper's dark eyes had warmth and kindness in them. He may have been the oldest of Absalom's creations, but in many ways Christopher thought of him as the most innocent. Gripper ground his jaws together with a hoarse metallic scrape. To the untutored this was just noise, but not to Christopher and the others. Mr. Absalom tried to sell Jack, Gripper, answered Christopher. Gripper looked at Absalom and spoke again. Absalom looked at him incredulously and pointed to Jack. Well, what do you think happened? A cowed Gripper took a step back and held his hands together against his chest in a penitent fashion. Absalom turned towards his shed, then stopped halfway, glared up at the sky, and turned back to Gripper. I'll need you tomorrow to help clear some snow. Gripper nodded slowly. Absalom looked at Christopher. It'll be a way of making money, he sneered. Christopher sighed and followed Absalom into the shed, only to find his master had stopped and stiffened just inside the threshold. There was a brief pause before Absalom raised his hands in an expansive gesture of welcome and said, Estelle! Absalom moved further into the shed and Christopher squeezed in behind him. Estelle was standing by the table. Like Christopher, 13-year-old Estelle was proper. She was wearing an old herringbone coat at least a size too big for her. Her oval-shaped face was framed by her dark hair, and she was glaring at the engineer. I've done what you asked, Mr. Absalom, she said. Absalom eyed her for a moment. Estelle was calm and serious and was never easily unnerved. She's like a real grown-up, thought Christopher with admiration, even though she's only a year older than me. Thank you, Estelle. As ever, I am filled with appreciation, and I know without even looking that your work is of the highest quality as always. Estelle stepped forward and sighed. 4 yards of skin, that's 4 shillings. Estelle held her hand out. Absalom looked at her palm and then looked at her in the eye with a sly, calculating look. I thought we'd agreed on 3, Estelle. It's a shilling a yard. It's always a shilling a yard, she replied, not moving her hand. Absalom sighed and reached into the pocket of his moth-eaten, oil-stained waistcoat and took out a small purse. He counted the money out into Estelle's palm, making a show with his quivering fingers, as if handing the money over was causing him great pain. Thank you, Estelle, he said. His voice was tremulous, almost self-pitying. Estelle merely grunted, pocketed the money and headed for the door. You're welcome to stay, Christopher blurted. Estelle looked at Christopher and frowned. "It's a cold night," said Christopher. I thought you might. That's if it's okay with Mr. Absalom." He looked at his master hopefully, but Absalom had lost interest and had turned to sort through the junk on his table. "Thank you, Christopher," said Estelle, "but I've got somewhere to stay." "You still lodging with old Mrs. Barnaby, Estelle?" asked Absalom without looking up. "That's right," she replied. "Lovely woman, respectable, very fine manners. Surprised you can afford her class of lodgings." Absalom smirked to himself, his lips pursing, as if he was trying to contain his laughter. Estelle clenched her jaw and gave him a murderous look that he didn't notice. She turned and walked out of the door, letting in a chilly gust of wind before slamming it behind her. Christopher frowned. "You should pay her more, Mr. Absalom." Absalom grunted. "She does fine work, and I look after her, and she knows it. She also gets the honour of working for a master craftsman like myself." Christopher raised his eyebrows at the word master craftsman. He very much doubted that a real master craftsman worked in conditions like this. The table wasn't the only mess. The whole interior of the hut was crammed with junk. Everything from pram wheels to empty cans. There were old wash basins, the shells of clocks that had been gutted for their springs and wheels, sheets of metal, copper wiring, and the smell of oil, rust, and Absalom's sweat. Anything that wasn't jammed onto a creaking shelf was left in a pile on the floor. On the left-hand wall there was a large painting hanging at an angle. It was yellowed and grubby with spots of mould, but if you looked closely you could see it was of a man in 18th century dress. He was standing with both hands on the pommel of a walking stick, and beside him there stood a wooden boy. The boy was covered in carved runes and glyphs. Absalom had rescued the painting from a rubbish tip. Sometimes he would stand under it with his hands on his hips, smiling up at the man in the painting as if he knew him and was greeting him like an equal. Occasionally Absalom would refer to himself in the same breath as some of the great engineers of the past. Christopher looked up and down. He didn't look much like a legendary engineer. "What are you going to make next, Mr. Absalom?" Christopher asked. Absalom had picked up 2 eyeballs from the table, and he gave them both a vigorous polish on his waistcoat. "Oh, I don't know. I think I'll take it as it comes this time. I shall let the muse transport me wherever it may." He gave a wave of his hand around the room. "I've had a new consignment of heads, one of which will be the crowning glory of my latest creation." Christopher looked around the room. There were more heads scattered around than usual, but they were a dull grey and looked badly moulded and scuffed. A few had dents in them, and knowing Absalom as he did, he knew they'd still have dents in them once they were up and walking about. He felt a twinge of sadness as he thought. Absalom's ill temper seemed to have waned, but Christopher could still sense a trace of resentment in his eyes over the botched sale. "You should get to bed, my boy. Get everyone inside the workshop. We've got a big day tomorrow." "Yes, Mr. Absalom," said Christopher. Ooh, another gripping chapter.